On a dusty plain in Mesopotamia, the greatest empire on earth wakes to its final day.
Against this ocean of soldiers rides a young king, Alexander of Macedon, with 40-odd thousand men and an impossible dream. Darius, king of kings, has chosen the ground. A perfect killing field, built to crush anyone.
But Alexander refuses a straight fight. With one sideways march, he stretches an army 11 miles wide.
200 chariots race in for the kill. Any other army would shatter. Alexander's phalanx breathes and turns the Persians' secret weapon against them.
In the swirling dust, a tiny gap appears. For anyone else, it is nothing.
The bronze wedge drives straight for the King of Kings. The immortals break, and Darius turns his chariot. In a single afternoon, 2 centuries of Persian rule begin to burn. From the camel's plain of Gaugamela,
Witness the tactics, the terror, and the 10 seconds of genius that changed history forever.
Nearly 50,000 men marched straight at a host that seemed to swallow the horizon. By the time the sun slid down over a dusty plain in Mesopotamia, the greatest empire on earth was no longer unshakable. It did not fall to a long war of attrition, nor to starving sieges or years of rebellion. It staggered in a single afternoon, on a field where one man's tactical mind tore apart more than 2 centuries of Persian dominance. In less than 8 hours, Alexander's army killed or captured a vast share of the Persian host, while losing only a small fraction of his own veterans. The numbers alone feel unreal, almost like legend. Yet the true miracle is not the count of bodies on the ground. It is how a smaller army walked into what should have been certain defeat and turned it into one of the most decisive victories in military history. The fate of what we now call Western civilization leaned heavily on that single day. At Gaugamela, the axis of the ancient world tilted. If the battle had ended differently, the map of languages, faiths, and ideas that would later shape Europe and the Mediterranean might never have looked the same. By the end of this story, you will see how Alexander did more than win a battle. He rewrote the rules of warfare in real time. You will hear about a gap that opened for barely half a minute, yet shattered an empire. About a secret weapon that should have sliced Macedonian ranks to ribbons, but instead turned into a trap for its own side. You will watch one bold cavalry maneuver, still studied in war colleges today, explode through a line that seemed unbreakable. You will see how scythed chariots, 200 of them, were turned into harmless wreckage without tearing a single Macedonian formation apart. You will also step inside the quieter battlefield, the mind. Before any spear was lowered, Alexander was already at war with Persian morale. He used psychology as a weapon, bending fear and pride, waking doubts in the hearts of men who had never before doubted their king. You will see the moment when the most powerful monarch of his age turned and fled, even though on paper his victory still looked almost guaranteed. How can a smaller force advance into a larger army and prevail? How could Alexander know where Darius would be weak on a battlefield that Darius himself had chosen and engineered? The answer is not simple luck. It is a mixture of preparation, nerve, and a way of seeing terrain and movement like pieces in a living puzzle. Because this battle was not just armies colliding. It was personal. Alexander and Darius had already met at Issus. There, on cramped ground between mountain and sea, the Persian king had broken and run, leaving behind not only his camp, but his own mother, wife, and daughters. That humiliation did not fade. It festered. When they faced each other again at Gaugamela, it was more than a contest of empires. It was a duel between 2 men carrying old ghosts. 2 years had passed since Issus. In that time, Darius had summoned the strength of a realm that stretched from the valleys of Egypt to the mountains near India. He swore that this time, the Macedonian upstart would not escape alive. He called vassal kings, tribal chiefs, and satraps from 3 continents. He promised them revenge, glory, and redemption. What took generations to build gathered on one plain to crush a conqueror still in his 20s. To understand how those plans fell apart on October 1st, 331 B.C.E., we need to roll back 3 years, to the moment when a young king first set foot on Asian soil. Alexander was only 20 when he crossed the Hellespont. He carried more than his own ambition. He carried the unfinished dream of his murdered father, Philip II, to unite the Greeks and strike back at the Persian Empire that had once torched their cities and threatened their freedom. Most rulers in their early 20s would have clung to their throne, terrified of rebellions, coups, and rival claimants. Alexander crushed his enemies at home with dizzying speed, then turned east without pausing. He stepped into Asia not as a cautious invader, but as if the continent had been waiting for him. His army marched with borrowed money and bold promises, but it also carried something new, a set of military innovations that turned lines of infantry and cavalry into a flexible machine. The heart of that machine was the phalanx armed with the sarissa, a pike so long it turned the front ranks into a moving wall of spearheads. Behind it stood a system of well-drilled units, each trained to pivot, advance, or halt on command without falling into chaos. On the flanks, he placed the companion cavalry, an elite corps that fought not as scattered horsemen, but as a single armored hammer, moving in wedge formations that could split enemy lines wide open. Most important of all was the way Alexander thought. He saw battlefields as patterns and angles rather than just crowds and chaos. Where others saw a flat plain, he saw routes, traps, and lines of force. Where others tried to win by simple courage and weight of numbers, he sought to bend the whole shape of the fight with a few key moves. Across the desert, Darius III, Shahanshah, King of Kings, also believed in his own destiny. He had not simply inherited the throne. He had fought rivals, navigated palace plots, and emerged as the supreme ruler of an empire that had outlived generations of enemies. He commanded resources beyond imagination, from the gold of distant mines to the grain of rich river valleys and the tribute of 50 million subjects. But Issus had changed him. On that cramped field, his great army had been squeezed and tangled by the terrain. His superior numbers became a disadvantage. He had watched Alexander's compact force cut through his men, watched his own chariot turn away while thousands still fought behind him. The memory of that retreat was a wound that refused to close. So when the time came to face Alexander again, Darius made a different choice. At Issus, the land had betrayed him. At Gaugamela, the land would obey him. He chose a plain whose name meant Camel's House, near what is now northern Iraq. It was broad, open, and exposed. No mountain walls, no narrow passes, no shoreline. Here, he told himself, his superiority in cavalry and exotic weapons would finally tell. For months before the battle, Persian engineers worked the ground like farmers preparing a sacred field. They flattened every bump, filled every hollow, and cleared every obstacle. Their aim was simple: create a surface where scythed chariots could race at full speed in any direction, and where huge wings of cavalry could sweep around both flanks without tripping over hidden ridges or rocks. Gaugamela became not just a battlefield, but a man-made stage. From across the empire, Darius summoned every kind of warrior his realm could field. Hard-riding Bactrian cavalry from the eastern satrapies, mounted archers from the north who could spin in the saddle and shoot backward at full gallop, Indian war elephants carrying towered archers, beasts the Macedonians had never before faced in battle. Greek mercenaries who understood Macedonian tactics almost as well as Alexander's own men, and at the center of it all, the immortals, the elite guard, whose very name promised that Persia's power could never truly die. On parchment, on clay tablets, and in the minds of Persian commanders, the plan looked flawless. The flat ground would unleash the scythed chariots. The broad front would allow the cavalry to stretch like a net and fold around the Macedonian line from both sides. The sheer width of the formation was meant to swallow Alexander whole. What no one yet understood was that in perfecting the ground for his own army, Darius had also created ideal conditions for his enemy's precision. When Alexander finally approached, his men were no longer fresh recruits. They had marched from Macedonia across Anatolia. They had stormed Tyre, a city thought impregnable. They had walked through Egypt and seen their king hailed as a living son of a god. They were fewer than the Persians by a wide margin, but they were hardened, supremely confident, and bound to Alexander by shared victories and shared danger. On the night before the battle, Persian watchfires lined the horizon in an unbroken chain. Macedonian scouts returned, shaking their heads. They could not even begin to count the enemy camp. It seemed to stretch without end, a glowing necklace of fire around the plain. In Darius's tent, surrounded by nobles and priests, confidence flowed like wine. How could this smaller army hope to break a host that spanned miles from wing to wing? In Alexander's camp, the mood was quieter, but not grim. His officers debated a night attack. The idea had some appeal. Surprise could even the odds. Parmenion, the seasoned general on his left, urged it. "Strike in the dark," he said. "Deny the Persians their perfect battlefield." Alexander refused. He would not steal victory. At first, that sounds like pride, the arrogance of a young king. In truth, it was one more layer of psychological warfare. By refusing a night assault, Alexander let his own troops rest, while the Persians spent the hours before dawn on edge, listening for hoofbeats in the dark, gripping weapons with sweaty hands. Anxiety grinds men down as surely as marching. When morning finally came on October 1st, 331 B.C.E., it rose on two armies that had not slept the same kind of night. As the first light spread over the plain of Gaugamela, the scale of what Alexander faced became fully visible. The Persian line seemed to go on forever, a glittering band of bronze and steel that caught the sunrise. At its heart stood Darius in his chariot, wrapped in royal colors, guarded by the immortals in their scale armor that shimmered like the skin of some enormous serpent. In front of them waited the scythed chariots, silent for now, like a row of crouching beasts. Opposite them, Alexander's army looked almost small by comparison. Yet within that smaller shape lay a design that no Persian engineer had accounted for, a pattern of depth, reserves, and angles that would soon begin to move. What happens next on this man-made plain will set up the tiny opening, the royal panic, and the empire-shattering collapse you'll see in the following part. As both armies finished forming, Alexander did something no Persian officer expected. Instead of lining up shoulder to shoulder with Darius's front, he tilted his own line. His right wing stood a little forward. His left wing hung back, almost as if it were reluctant to fight. It looked uneven. It looked risky. It was deliberate. Behind each wing, he placed reserves. These were not an afterthought. They were flying columns, ready to move wherever trouble flared. In an age when most kings loved long, straight lines of troops, Alexander built depth and flexibility. He was designing a living instrument, not a wall of meat and bronze. Across the field, Darius watched in puzzlement. Why shorten an already smaller front? Why offer a thinner line to an army that seemed to stretch forever? Some Persian nobles whispered that the Macedonian king had finally lost his nerve. Others thought he was trying to avoid full contact. No one understood that Alexander was already beginning to pull the Persian formation out of shape. Then he went one step further. Under the rising sun, Alexander gave a quiet order. His entire army began to march to the right. Not forward, sideways. The whole line slid across the plain like a single disciplined creature. Shields locked, spears upright, hooves and sandals beating the earth in perfect rhythm. This sideways move broke every rule in the old manuals of war. Armies were supposed to walk straight at each other, collide, and push. Alexander was refusing the script. By drifting toward rougher ground on the right, he aimed to drag the fight away from the perfect surface Darius had spent months preparing. For the Persian king, the choice was painful and immediate. If he stayed where he was, the scythed chariots would lose their ideal runway. If he let Alexander reach broken terrain, his great advantage in mobility would fade. So he did what seemed logical. He ordered his left wing to extend and follow. The Persian line began to stretch. Units shifted. Horsemen trotted to keep contact. That 11-mile front, impressive and terrifying, was being pulled thinner and thinner, like a rope drawn too tight. From Darius's chariot, it still looked solid. From Alexander's saddle, small spaces were already starting to appear. To stop the Macedonians from slipping too far to the right, Darius threw out his first punch. He sent forward a mass of cavalry from his left. Bactrian riders who had grown up in the saddle. Scythian horse archers who could twist and fire backward at full speed. To them, the Macedonian right looked temptingly exposed. Alexander had planned for this moment with almost eerie precision. On his extreme right, he had placed a smaller group of horsemen under Menidas, about 600 riders. Against the Persian wave, they were a grain of sand facing the tide. That was their purpose. Menidas spurred his men forward. The two forces slammed together in a brief clash of spear points and screaming horses. Then, on Alexander's orders, the smaller force began to give ground. Not in panic, in a controlled retreat, pulling the heavier Persian mass farther and farther away from the safety of their own center. Persian blood was up. They pressed on, chasing what looked like a crumbling flank. Dust rose. Shouts merged into a single roar. Alexander fed more units into the swirling melee, Paeonian cavalry, then more companions under Clytus. Soon the right wing became a storm of flashing bronze and plunging horses. To Darius, this meant his left wing was engaged and doing its job. It was fixing Alexander's right in place, and he hoped, wrapping around it. What he did not see clearly was the cost. Those same horsemen would not be ready to help when his center began to strain. The net that was supposed to close around the Macedonians was already starting to tear. Now Darius played the card he believed would crush Macedonian courage in one stroke. He ordered the scythed chariots to charge. 200 war chariots rumbled forward. Each one bristled with blades fixed to wheels and axles. The horses had been trained to ignore screams and blood. Their purpose was simple and brutal. They were meant to carve lanes through infantry, to slice legs and arms, to tear open formations so Persian cavalry could flood in. The ground trembled under their speed. Drivers whipped their teams. Sunlight flashed on steel. For a heartbeat, even hardened Macedonian veterans felt a chill. This was a weapon built not just for killing, but for terror. Alexander's answer was calm and rehearsed. He had drilled his army again and again for this very scene. Trumpets sounded. Orders passed down the line with quiet urgency. The phalangites did not freeze. They did not bunch up. At a set distance, they did something that would make later generals stare in disbelief. They opened, ranks parted just enough to form narrow corridors. The forest of sarissas stepped aside like tall reeds in a controlled wind. Between those living walls, channels appeared, leading straight toward the rear. From a distance to a panicked driver with dust in his eyes, it looked like the Macedonian front had finally broken. The chariots raced into the gaps. Then the real trap snapped shut. From the flanks of each corridor, light infantry surged in. Men with javelins, with short spears, with bows. They had been waiting. They knew exactly where the chariots would go. Instead of slashing into packed ranks, the enemy machines now hurtled down narrow lanes under a hail of missiles. The Macedonians did not waste time hacking at the blades. They went for the horses first. When a team stumbled, an entire chariot turned from weapon to wreck. Wood splintered. Wheels snapped. Drivers were dragged, crushed, or finished off on the ground. Those few vehicles that somehow made it through the channels found only more troops waiting behind the main line, ready to kill the crews and seize or smash the machines. In moments, Darius's terrifying invention had failed in full view of both armies. The psychological effect was reversed. The weapon that was meant to shatter Macedonian morale instead cracked Persian confidence. Men who had trusted in the chariots now saw twisted frames, dying horses, and scattered wreckage where triumph was supposed to be. While the center reeled from this shock, the real crisis was building on the other side of the field. On the Macedonian left, under Parmenion, the Persian right wing hit like a hammer. Cappadocian and Armenian nobles led heavy cavalry into the allied Greek horsemen and Thessalians. This was warfare at its rawest. Shield against shield, blade against bone. Parmenions' men bent under the pressure. They were pushed back, step by bloody step. At some points, Persian riders punched gaps through the line and threatened to spill into the Macedonian rear. Farther out, parts of the Persian cavalry found a wider opening and began to angle toward the baggage camp, where Alexander's treasure, supplies, and wounded lay almost undefended. For a king, the thought of seeing his baggage seized in mid-battle was a nightmare. Lose that, and your army can unravel even after a tactical victory. Alexander did not yet know how close this danger was. His eyes were fixed on the center, where dust, noise, and fear were about to create the fleeting chance he had been building toward since dawn. Because while everyone's attention was pulled toward the spectacular scenes, the cavalry storm on the flanks, the chariot charge in the middle, something quieter and more decisive was happening. The immense Persian front, stretched and pulled by Alexander's oblique march and by its own attempts to envelop, was starting to lose perfect contact. It was not a huge break, not a gaping hole, just a widening seam between units near where Darius himself stood. A space where no shields overlapped, where no spears crossed to cover. In the chaos of battle, such a gap might last only seconds. But seconds were all Alexander needed. He saw it. In the swirling dust, in the flicker of armor and banners, his eyes caught the line where Persian troops no longer touched edge to edge. It was like noticing a hairline crack in a dam just before it bursts. Many commanders would have missed it. Alexander had been waiting 3 years for exactly this kind of flaw. His command cut through the noise. Form the wedge. Companion cavalry tightened around him. 2,000 armored riders swung into their familiar, deadly shape. Alexander at the tip, his closest friends behind him, the formation widening like the head of a spear. Beside them, the hypaspists, those elite shield-bearers, readied themselves to run in the wake of the charge and hold whatever space the horsemen ripped open. Ahead lay that narrow weakness in the Persian center. Beyond it stood Darius's royal chariot, ringed by the immortals and nobles of the empire. Between them and Alexander stretched only a short stretch of trampled earth, already crowded with the confused and the wounded. On that strip of ground, in the next moments, the balance of 220 years of Persian power would tilt. In the next part, you will ride with that charging wedge as it slams toward the King of Kings. Watch the line crack, see Darius make his fatal choice, and follow the slaughter and pursuit that turned Gaugamela from a battle into the death certificate of an empire. What came after Alexander's charge would decide not only who owned that dusty field, but whether the Persian Empire would still exist as dawn approached. The signal was given. The companion cavalry surged forward in their wedge, hooves pounding, armor rattling like iron rain. At the tip of that moving triangle rode Alexander himself, his cloak streaming behind him, Bucephalus driving on under the spur. Behind and around him, the closest companions formed the narrow edge. Behind them, rank after rank spread wider, turning that human spear into a storm. A charging horse at full gallop hits with the force of a crashing cart. 2,000 of them, in a tight formation, become something else entirely. The ground shook. Dust rose in choking clouds. To the men in the Persian center, it did not look like ordinary cavalry. It looked like a metal-tipped wave coming straight at the heart of their line. Darius watched from his chariot, high above the press of men. He had seen Alexander before at Issus, but never like this. There, the Macedonian king had been one commander among many. Here he was a clear, lethal arrowhead aimed directly at the royal position. The gap that had looked small and manageable a moment ago now gaped wider as the wedge drove toward it. On paper, the immortals and the dense foot soldiers near Darius should have been able to slide over and close the seam. In reality, orders had to be shouted, repeated, translated, and pushed through noise and panic. Men were already engaged, already turning to face threats of their own. The line could not move like a single mind. The hypaspists ran at the trot beside the cavalry. Their bronze shields and spears bobbed as they moved, breath already burning in their chests. It was almost impossible for infantry to keep pace with the charge, but these were the best-trained foot soldiers in Alexander's army. Their job was simple and brutal. Follow the wedge. Hold the wound it opened. Stop it from healing. The first contact was sudden and terrible. The front point of the wedge slammed into the thin Persian screen near the gap. Men flew backward. Spears snapped. Some soldiers went down from the impact alone, crushed under hooves before blades even touched them. The companions did not slow. They drove deeper, hacking and thrusting, leaning from their saddles to strike at faces and throats. Behind the initial contact, the wedge pushed more bodies into the break. The hypaspists poured in behind, forming a solid block that kept the gap open. It was as if the Macedonians had punched a door into the Persian line and then jammed it with a bronze bar. The immortals tried to pivot. Their scale armor caught the light as they turned, shields coming up, spears lowering. They were brave. They were disciplined. But they had been trained for battles where lines met evenly, rank to rank. Now they faced an enemy hitting from an angle, already inside the edge of their formation. Their careful order began to fray. Alexander was everywhere at once. One moment he was at the tip of the wedge, driving Bucephalus straight at a cluster of Persian nobles. The next, he wheeled to strike at a pocket of men trying to form a new line. His spear shattered under the force of his thrusts. He drew his sword without hesitation and kept killing. Every blow was chosen. Every turn of his horse placed him where the line was still thin. Behind him, the phalanx began to move. 9,000 sarissas lowered in unison, the long pikes angling forward as one. The phalangites stepped into the opening carved by the cavalry, then spread out, front and flank, like a bronze hedgehog unrolling. Men watching from the Persian side saw something they had never faced before. Not a wall coming at them from one direction, but a forest of spears pressing from two. The mathematics of the battlefield shifted in an instant. On the flanks, the Persians still had more horsemen. In the center, where it mattered most, they were now being attacked from front and side at the same time. Numbers lost their meaning. Packed men in fine armor found themselves squeezed, stabbed, and shoved with no space to swing their own weapons. Panic moves faster than orders. Word spread through the Persian ranks like fire through dry grass. The Macedonians are in the center. The immortals are falling back. The king is under threat. Men at the rear, who could not see clearly through the dust, listened to the rising note of fear and felt it in their bones. They began to edge backward. Backward became turning away. Turning away became running. In the middle of that growing storm stood Darius. For a moment, he could still have changed everything. If he had stayed, if he had driven his chariot forward into the gap with fresh troops tight behind him, some units might have rallied. The sheer sight of the Shahanshah standing firm could have bought precious minutes. Instead, he saw Alexander breaking toward him through the haze. He saw the royal banner dipping as men died around it. He saw the immortals, his proud guard, giving ground. He remembered Issus, the first flight, the shame that had burned ever since. Faced with that memory and this reality, Darius chose life over the thin chance of restoring the line. He turned. The royal chariot wheeled away from the fight. The driver cracked the reins. Horses lunged forward. In that heartbeat, the King of Kings became just another man fleeing for his life. Those near him saw it first. Then the knowledge raced outward. The king is running. The king is leaving us. No army built on royal authority can watch its ruler flee and remain whole. Men who had been fighting hard a moment before now felt their courage ripped out of them. If the man chosen by the gods had given up, what chance did they have? The center began to melt away, units breaking off, drifting back, then racing to escape. Alexander saw the chariot spin and go. It must have been a tempting sight. The man he had chased across half of Asia was finally within reach. His back literally turned. A relentless pursuit might end the entire war in one day. Capture or kill Darius here, and the Persian Empire would lose not just a battle, but its living symbol. But Alexander was not just a hunter. He was also a commander responsible for the living men around him. A messenger arrived from the left. The news was grim. Parmenion was in trouble. On the Macedonian left, the storm had reached its peak. The Persian right wing had driven the allied Greek cavalry and the Thessalians to the brink. Some of the enemy horsemen had already broken through in places, pushing dangerously close to the baggage camp. Stores, treasure, wounded soldiers, attendants, and camp followers were all at risk. If the camp fell, panic could ripple right back into Alexander's own lines. Victory at the center might yet rot from the edges. Parmenion sent urgent word. He needed help, and he needed it fast. Alexander now faced a choice as sharp as any spear point. Keep driving after Darius and risk his left wing collapsing, or give up the perfect chance to end the war in a single charge and ride to rescue his own men. It was a test of priorities, of character as much as of strategy. He chose his army. Alexander wheeled the companions around. Men who had been galloping toward fleeing nobles now had to wrench their horses around and push them back through the wreckage of the center. The return ride was a nightmare. The field between the broken Persian center and Parmenion's position was littered with bodies, smashed chariots, dropped shields, and dying horses. The companions forced their way through it all. Exhausted men straightened in their saddles. Many had broken lances or blood-slick swords. They had to find yet another reserve of strength. They did it because their king did it first, turning his back on the fleeing Shahanshah to help a hard-pressed subordinate. On the left, Parmenian's troops were close to breaking. The Thessalians had fought like lions, but weight and numbers were finally telling. The Persian cavalry under Mazaeus had pushed them back toward rougher ground and toward the baggage. One more hard shove might have opened the way. Then Alexander's charge hit them from behind. The companions slammed into the rear of the Persian right like a second hammer. Men who had been leaning forward into the fight now felt a new blow between their shoulders. Confusion became shock. Shock became terror. Surrounded, those proud horsemen who had almost turned the Macedonian flank now found themselves with enemies on all sides. Some tried to carve a path out. Others dropped their spears and ran. Many never made it. Between Parmenian's battered line and Alexander's fresh wedge, the Persian right wing shattered. The few units that escaped carried with them stories not of near victory, but of sudden disaster. The battle line was gone now. What remained on the Persian side was a mass of scattered troops, some still fighting in knots, others already streaming away in small groups. The tidy formation that had stretched like a gleaming belt across the plain at dawn had dissolved into pockets of resistance and rivers of fugitives. As the sun dropped lower toward the horizon, Gaugamela changed shape. It was no longer a contest. It was a hunt. Macedonian cavalry poured out in different directions, chasing down those who fled. Light horsemen rode wide to cut off escape routes. Heavy riders targeted clusters of nobles and officers, trying to tear out the last threads of organized resistance. The field that had been prepared so carefully now betrayed its owners. There were no hills, no forests, no ravines where broken units could hide and regroup. On that flattened stage, running men had nowhere to vanish. Soon, the cries of formation commands faded. In their place came the sounds of pursuit. Short clashes, distant screams, the wet thud of bodies hitting the dirt. Gaugamela had become what every general secretly fears and every conqueror secretly desires: a one-sided slaughter. In the next part, you will follow that slaughter through the falling night. See how many Persians paid for their king's flight. Watch Alexander march almost straight from victory into the heart of the empire, and trace how 8 hours on a camel's plane broke open the road to Babylon, Susa, and the birth of a new world. What unfolded after the battle itself ended would matter even more in the long run, leading to the fall of cities, the death of a king, and the birth of a new world you'll see fully revealed in the next part. As the Persian line dissolved, Gaugamela stopped looking like a battlefield and started looking like a flood. The direction of that flood was one way, away from Alexander, away from the gap in the center, away from the spot where the King of Kings had turned his chariot and vanished into dust. For the surviving Persians, there were only 2 instincts left: run or die. For the Macedonians, there was only one clear order: pursue. Alexander split his forces like a surgeon cutting along known lines. He did not throw everyone into a wild chase. Some units pinned down pockets of resistance still fighting in the center. Others rode out along the flanks, aiming to cut off escape. The Thessalian cavalry, battered but unbroken, spurred forward on one side. The companions, still wrapped around their king, drove deeper after the richest targets fleeing in front of them. The plain that had seemed so carefully organized at dawn was now a maze of terror. Men trying to escape trampled their comrades. Riders crashed into their own infantry. Different languages shouted different orders, none of them in harmony, Bactrians yelled at Armenians. Indians shouted to men from Syria. Many could not even understand each other. The divisions that once kept the empire stable now turned the retreat into chaos. There were no hills to shelter behind, no forest to vanish into, no twisting valleys to hide broken units. On that flattened stage, every fleeing group of soldiers was visible for miles. Macedonian scouts pointed. Cavalry squadrons turned and pounced, again and again. The pursuit did not end when the sun kissed the horizon. Alexander knew that a beaten army can rise again, but a shattered one cannot. He drove his men on into the gathering dark. Torches flared. Hooves pounded on hard ground long after shape and distance blurred. For mile after mile, the same desperate pattern repeated. A group of Persians tried to rally. Macedonian horsemen crashed into them. Brief resistance, then flight or death. Some accounts speak of pursuit for about 35 miles. Others speak of the chase lasting through most of the night. Exact figures do not matter as much as the feeling. There was no safe point where Persian soldiers could stop, breathe, and reorganize. There was only running and the fear that the next cloud of dust behind them brought Alexander himself. While cavalry hunted ahead, Macedonian infantry moved among the fallen. The field near the old center became a map of ruin. Wrecked chariots lay on their sides, blades bent or broken. Horses lay twisted with their harnesses still strapped on. The bodies of the immortals, once thought to be beyond defeat, now formed heaps of quiet armor and pooled blood. The so-called scythed machines that were meant to carve holes in enemy lines had instead become markers showing exactly where the Persian plan had failed. By the time darkness thickened, rough counts began. The Macedonians had lost perhaps about 1,200 men. It was a painful loss. These were not raw recruits. They were hardened veterans who had marched with Alexander for years. But when they looked across the plain, they saw the difference. On the Persian side, the dead lay in dense clusters. Some had died facing the enemy. Others had died with their backs turned as they tried to flee. When Macedonian officers tried to count, the numbers blurred. The final totals given in ancient sources vary, but all agree on one thing. Tens of thousands of Persians did not leave that field alive. Think of an entire city wiped out in a day. That is the scale of what Gaugamela cost the empire. Even that toll does not tell the whole story. Many more Persians threw away shields and armor to run faster. They scattered in small bands, leaderless and hungry, drifting toward home or toward distant satrapies. Units that had once marched in proud ranks now dissolved into survivors stumbling down dusty tracks. An army that had taken months to summon vanished in a single afternoon and night. As dawn approached on October 2nd, the shape of victory came into sharper focus. The Persian camp fell completely into Macedonian hands. The huge royal pavilion, with its rich carpets and golden fittings, belonged now to Alexander. The baggage trains, loaded with treasure and supplies, no longer fed the armies of Darius. They would feed Macedonian ambitions instead. Among the captured spoils lay something more valuable than coins or fine cloth. There were documents, letters, lists, records. Through these, Alexander could read the inner workings of the empire he had just broken on the battlefield. He could see which governors might surrender without a fight, which cities held large garrisons, which nobles were wavering in their loyalty. Gaugamela gave him not just land, but information. Alexander moved through his camp that morning with a clear purpose. He did not allow his army to sink into drunk celebration. There was no long pause for feasting over the fallen. He understood that the battle had broken the spear of Persia, but the body of the empire still lived. To end this war, he had to move quickly, while shock and fear still numbed his enemies. He also understood something else. His army needed to feel seen. Macedonian surgeons and medics worked at a furious pace. An organized medical corps, inherited from Philip and improved by Alexander, treated wounds that would have killed men in other armies. The king visited units that had suffered most. He spoke to officers by name. He handed out shares of Persian gold with a generous hand. This was not simple kindness. It was part of his method. A king who showed up after the bloodshed, who knew which unit had held under impossible strain and which subordinate had almost died to hold a flank, bound his men to him more tightly than any oath alone. Campaigns still lay ahead. He needed them loyal not just to Macedonia, but to him personally. Word of the battle spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Messengers rode in all directions. To the Greek cities, carrying the news that the great enemy of generations had been humbled for good. To the satraps and city rulers of the East, carrying a different message. The man who had smashed the royal army at Gaugamela was now riding toward their gates. Within about 10 days, Alexander approached Babylon. This ancient city, long a jewel in the imperial crown, could have chosen resistance. Its walls were strong. Its tradition of independence was deep. But the psychological weight of Gaugamela pressed down on its leaders. They opened their gates instead. Alexander entered not as a besieger, but as a welcomed conqueror. From Babylon, he did not linger. He moved on to Susa. This was not just another city. It was one of the empire's great treasure houses. Its vaults held a hoard in silver and gold that had been stacked up over generations. When Susa fell into his hands, the young king who had once borrowed heavily to fund his crossing into Asia now controlled wealth on a scale hard to imagine. Through all of this, Darius still lived. He fled eastward, deeper into the heartlands beyond the Zagros Mountains, trying to gather yet another army. But each mile he rode, his authority shrank. Satraps who once bowed to him without question now hesitated. Some secretly reached out to Alexander. Others decided that changing sides might be safer than dying for a wounded cause. In the end, Darius did not die on a battlefield. He died at the hands of his own. Bessus, a satrap who hoped to save himself and perhaps win favor with Alexander, betrayed and killed the King of Kings as he fled. When Macedonian scouts finally found Darius's body, Alexander is said to have covered it with his own cloak and sent it back to Persepolis for a royal burial. Even in death, the fallen ruler served as a symbol, not of unbroken empire, but of a world that had failed to adapt and now lay open to a new master. Meanwhile, Alexander moved steadily toward Persepolis itself, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid dynasty. This was the city whose grand halls and reliefs had once broadcast Persian glory to visiting envoys. Now, within about 3 months of Gaugamela, that same city would open its gates to the man who had shattered its armies. The sense of inevitability was complete. Yet, for all its speed and drama, this dismantling of Persia had rested on razor-thin chances. If Parmenian's left wing had collapsed before Alexander could ride to its aid, if the baggage camp had fallen and news of its loss had spread through Macedonian ranks, if Darius had stood his ground at the center and inspired a last, desperate stand. On that October day in 331 B.C.E., history had balanced on several blades at once. In the next part, you will step back from the dust and blood of Gaugamela to see its wider shockwaves, follow how this single afternoon on a camel's plain helped create the Hellenistic world, and explore the haunting question of what might have happened if Alexander's charge had failed, or if the King of Kings had chosen to stand instead of flee. In the final part of this story, we will follow Gaugamela's echo into later ages and ask whether it was destiny or one man's gamble. But before that, we need to see exactly what changed on that day. When the dust settled over the Camel's Plain, the raw numbers told a story that sounded like myth. The Macedonian army still stood almost intact. They had lost barely more men than a single small town could hold. On the other side, the Persian dead covered the earth in heaps big enough to pass for villages. It was as if almost an entire army had been erased, while the attackers had lost only a sliver of their strength. If you turn that into rough ratios, it becomes even more unreal. For every Macedonian who fell, dozens of Persians never rose again. Most of the enemy force had been killed, scattered, or captured. In contrast, Alexander's army had lost less than a small fraction of its total. On a ledger, it looked less like a battle and more like a one-sided execution. Yet the deeper victory was not in corpses. It was in minds. After Gaugamela, no army on earth could face Alexander with a steady heart. His men had watched their king ride straight at the largest empire they had ever heard of and pierce it at the center. His enemies had watched a host that seemed too big to fail turn into a panicked crowd in a single day. A legend of invincibility was born, and legends travel faster than soldiers. As that legend spread, resistance began to fold in on itself. City gates that might once have stayed shut swung open at the sight of Macedonian banners. Rulers who might have chosen to fight behind high walls instead sent envoys with keys and gifts. When news of Gaugamela rode ahead of Alexander, it did half the work for him. The memory of the Camel's Plain marched with him into Babylon, into Susa, and later into the ceremonial heart at Persepolis. What died at Gaugamela was not only an army, and not only an empire. A whole balance of the ancient world tipped. For more than 220 years, power had flowed mainly from east to west. Gold, silk, spices, and commands radiated outward from Persian courts, crossing deserts and mountains to reach smaller kingdoms on the edges. After that single afternoon, the current began to reverse. Alexander did not simply replace one ruling family with another. In his wake came something new. Veterans settled in conquered lands. Greek became the language of markets and royal decrees. Philosophers, builders, and merchants followed soldiers. The result was a web of cities and kingdoms strung from Egypt to the borders of India, all sharing some form of Greek-style culture while still resting on older local traditions. We now call this mixed world Hellenistic, born in part from the shockwave of Gaugamela. Think of the chain that followed. In Egypt, a new city on the sea, Alexandria, grew into a center of learning whose great library tried to collect all written knowledge. In the wider Mediterranean, mathematicians and engineers took older ideas and pushed them into new shapes. Philosophical schools in places like Athens and later in Hellenistic cities argued about ethics, politics, and the nature of the universe. Rome, rising in the West, would absorb this Greek-speaking world and build its empire on top of it. When later religions took root inside that Roman and post-Roman space, they did so in soil already seeded with Hellenistic ideas. Arguments about divine law, reason, and the soul did not appear in a vacuum. They unfolded in languages, cities, and institutions shaped by the long shadow of Alexander's conquests. Trace those lines backward, and you find yourself again on that plain in Mesopotamia, watching a smaller army drive a wedge into a larger one. Military thinkers have never left Gaugamela alone. Long after the dust cleared, generals pored over what Alexander had done there. They studied the slanting approach, the way he refused a straight clash of lines. They traced how he used a sideways march to stretch a larger enemy, how he tempted cavalry off one wing with bait, how he prepared counters for the scythed chariots long before the first wheel turned. They noted how he combined each arm of his force. Infantry did not fight alone. Cavalry did not fight alone. Light troops, heavy infantry, elite guards, and horsemen all moved like parts of one machine. Today, we call that combined arms. On that October day in 331 B.C.E., it was still a fresh vision. Later captains, from early modern warlords to European emperors and modern staff officers, have watched Gaugamela as if watching an early demonstration of principles they still use. But Gaugamela raises a question that no drill manual can fully answer. Was this outcome inevitable because Persia was already decaying? Or did it require Alexander's specific blend of daring and calculation to bring the empire crashing down in 8 hours? The Persian state had its cracks. Succession struggles had weakened royal authority. Corruption had eaten into some parts of the court and provinces. Heavy reliance on distant levies and hired troops meant armies that did not always share one heart. Yet this same empire had survived turmoil before. It had faced revolts, assassinations, and foreign enemies and still held together. It took something more than general decay to turn a powerful realm into a broken one in a single day. It took a commander willing to risk his own life in the front rank of a charge aimed at the enemy king. It took a mind that saw the battlefield as a set of moving lines and probabilities, rather than a simple contest of courage. It took someone ready to abandon a personal chase for glory, turn his horse, and ride to save a threatened wing even when his greatest enemy was within sight. There is another way to see Gaugamela. Imagine a handful of knife edges laid side by side. Alexander had to cross each one without slipping. One slip, and history might have looked different. If the scythed chariots had struck a less disciplined army, they might have torn open the phalanx and let Persian horse flood through. If Parmenian's men on the left had snapped before the companions could arrive, a rolling collapse could have struck Alexander's own rear. If Darius had stayed in his chariot and driven it toward the breach instead of away from it, his courage alone might have given his wavering troops enough strength to hold a little longer. Even Alexander's own survival was not guaranteed. On that day, as on others, he fought close enough to the enemy that a single blade stroke could have ended his story on the spot. His life was saved more than once by loyal companions who threw themselves into danger for him. If one of those rescues had come a heartbeat too late, there would have been no long Macedonian empire in Asia, no spreading of Hellenistic cities, no legend of a world conqueror dying young in Babylon. Picture a world where Gaugamela ends differently. Perhaps Persia staggers but does not fall. Perhaps Alexander dies there, and his generals drag what remains of the army back toward the sea. A stronger, still unbroken Eastern Empire might later meet a rising Rome on more equal terms. Ideas, gods, and laws could have flowed along very different routes. The map we now know in our history books might show a very different center of gravity. Instead, reality followed the path cut by that bronze wedge on the camel's plain. Alexander lived. Darius fled. The Persian army broke. Within a few months, the greatest cities of the empire had opened their gates to a foreign king still in his early 30s. Within a few short years, Greek speech and Macedonian garrisons stood in places where, not long before, Persian officials had ruled with confidence. When modern historians debate which battle was the most decisive in human history, Gaugamela always stands near the top of the list. Not only because one side's losses were so crushing, and not only because an empire fell in its aftermath, but because so much that came afterward grew from this single day. On October 1st, 331 B.C.E., on a plain whose name meant camel's house, individual genius bent probability, crushed a superpower, and nudged the whole future of East and West onto a new track.